April 15th. Itenjobai Sishisan, Arshabar. 000 feet above the Pas de Calais. France. Frost clings to the edges of the heavy-framed canopy as First Lieutenant Jack Mackay scans the blinding white horizon and spots a predatory glint of hostile silver that makes his stomach drop. Inside the cramped, freezing cockpit of his newly issued Republic P-47B Thunderbolt, Mackay breathes heavily into his rubber oxygen mask. The air up here is thin, punishingly cold, and deeply unforgiving. Beneath the cowl ahead of him roars a 2.000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R. 2800 double Wasp radial engine. It is a masterpiece of American engineering, but it comes with a terrifying caveat. The aircraft wrapped around it weighs over 14,000 pounds, fully loaded, coming from the nimble, razor-sharp British Spitfires that his squadron had previously flown. Climbing into the Thunderbolt felt like strapping into a cast-iron bathtub. It was massive, it was heavy, and to the veteran pilots of the United States 8th Air Force, it felt entirely like the wrong tool for dogfighting. Miles away, slicing through the stratosphere with predatory grace, flies Lieutenant Klaus Weber of Jagdgeschwader 26, the infamous Abbeville boys. Weber is sitting behind the controls of a Focke-Wulf W190A, a sleek, agile, and heavily armed butcher bird that currently rules the European skies. His squadron has been scrambling all morning to intercept the incoming waves of American B-17 flying fortresses. As Weber's swarm of 4 fighters breaks through a veil of cirrus clouds, he expects to see the familiar, delicate silhouettes of Spitfires escorting the bombers. Instead, he sees something completely alien. Weber squints through his Revy gunsight. Hovering on the flanks of the bomber formation are aircraft of impossible proportions. Their fuselages are swollen, barrel-like, resembling flying milk jugs more than machines of war. Their wings are broad and distinctly blunt-tipped. Over the crackling VHF radio, Weber hears the bewildered voices of his comrades. Laughter cuts through the static. Sie dir diesen fliegenden Panzer an. A wingman chuckles. Look at this flying tank. To the seasoned Luftwaffe pilots, who prized maneuverability and rate of climb above all else. This new American fighter is a joke. It defies all conventional aerodynamic logic of the era. They assume it is sluggish. A heavy bomber disguised as a fighter. A cumbersome target practice drone that will easily fall prey to the Focke-Wulf's 420mm cannons. Weber pushes his throttle forward, the BMW 801 engine howling in response, and rolls his 190 into a steep, banking dive to bounce the trailing American back in the P-47. Mackay's neck swivels constantly on a well-worn pivot. The Thunderbolt's razorback canopy creates a treacherous blind spot at his rear. Suddenly, his radio barks to life with the frantic warning of his wingman. Bandits. 6 o'clock high. Breaking down hard. Mackay glances over his shoulder and sees the terrifying radial engine profile of an FDU-190 growing rapidly in his rearview mirror. The leading edges of the German fighter's wings flash with strobing yellow light muzzle flashes. Weber expects the American to try and turn. If the massive beast attempts a tight, horizontal turn, it will bleed all of its airspeed, stall, and present a massive, barn-sized target for his Minenjesco's high-explosive 20mm shells. Weber fires a ranging burst. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 explosive shells impact the right wing and tail of Mackay's Thunderbolt. In a Spitfire, hits like this would tear the fragile control surfaces to ribbons, instantly sending the plane into a fatal, uncontrollable spin. Mackay instinctively flinches, bracing for the catastrophic structural failure. It never comes. The heavy beast merely shudders. The thick aluminum skin, robust internal sparse, and massive armor plate behind Mackay's seat absorb the brutal impact with a terrifying nonchalance. The P-47 doesn't snap. It doesn't burn. It simply keeps flying. Weber's eyes widen in absolute disbelief behind his goggles. He had seen bombers fall apart from less punishment. He adjusts his rudder, preparing to deliver the killing blow to the damaged. Clunky American. But Mackay remembers the stern words of his commanding officer during the bleak morning briefing: do not try to turn with them. If you get bounced, use the weight. Mackay shoves the heavy control stick violently forward and rams the throttle to the firewall. He injects the water-methanol mixture into the cylinders, pushing the monstrous engine to war emergency power. The 7-ton Thunderbolt noses over into a vertical plunge. Gravity seizes the immense mass of the aircraft, to Weber's utter shock. The flying tank doesn't just dive, it plummets like a streamlined anvil, accelerating at a rate that completely defies his comprehension. Weber pushes his 4-190 into a pursuing dive, absolutely certain he can run down the lumbering giant. But as his airspeed indicator creeps past 400, then 450 miles per hour, his controls stiffen dangerously, the Focke-Wulf protesting the immense aerodynamic strain. Ahead of him, the P-47 effortlessly pulls away, rocketing past 500 miles per hour, completely unfazed by the terminal velocity, leaving the stunned German pilot in its turbulent wake. The laughter in the Luftwaffe headsets abruptly dies. The beast isn't just tough in a dive, it is untouchable. Mackay feels his cheeks sag and his vision tunnel into a narrow, greying tube as he hauls back on the heavy control stick. The G-forces press on his chest like a physical weight, attempting to force the blood from his brain. At over 500 miles per hour, a lesser airframe would have shed its wings under the immense aerodynamic stress of the pullout. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was built like a bridge girder. Its massive semi-elliptical wings bite into the dense lower air at 15,000 feet, groaning but holding firm. As Mackay levels out, his airspeed is still tremendous. He immediately shoves the stick back again, pitching the heavy nose toward the heavens in a punishing zoom climb. The massive turbo-supercharger, housed deep in the belly of the fuselage behind the cockpit, whines with a deafening, metallic shriek. It force-feeds dense, compressed air into the Pratt & Whitney engine, ensuring the R-2800 doesn't just maintain power, but thrives in the climb. He is converting his massive kinetic energy back into altitude, riding a frictionless elevator back into the fight. Above him, Lieutenant Weber is fighting his own machine. The controls of his Fevlu 190 had locked up completely in the dive, a terrifying aerodynamic phenomenon known as compressibility, sweating through his flight suit. Weber had been forced to roll trim just to level out at 18,000 feet. He breathes heavily, scanning the patchwork of French fields below, searching for the greasy black plume of smoke that signifies a crashed American. There is no smoke. Instead, a frantic transmission crackles in his headset. Kommt wieder hoch. Kommt wieder hoch. He's coming back up. Weber snaps his head to the right, just in time to see the impossible. The gigantic, barrel-chested American fighter hasn't just survived the plunge. It has rebounded, tearing upward in a near-vertical climb. The P-47's energy retention is unlike anything the Luftwaffe has ever encountered. It doesn't bleed speed in the vertical. It uses its sheer, terrifying mass as a battering ram of momentum. Mackay's head is on a swivel. He bursts through a wispy layer of stratus clouds and spots his target, one of Weber's wingmen, a W-190 that had attempted to follow the dive but broke off early. Now wallowing at low speed near the top of an arcing turn, the German pilot is perfectly silhouetted against the blinding mid-morning sun, utterly oblivious to the massive juggernaut hurtling up into his blind spot. This is the exact doctrine the 8th Air Force commanders had drilled into them. You don't turn with the butcher bird. You slash at it. You boom. And you zoom. Mackay lines up the delicate glowing crosshairs of his Mark 8 reflector sight with the pristine, grey camouflaged fuselage of the Focke-Wulf. He waits until the wingspan of the German fighter fills the reticle. The arming switches on his dash are already flipped. Housed inside the thick wings of the Thunderbolt are 8 Browning A.M.2 50 caliber machine guns. It is an astonishing, almost excessive amount of firepower for a single-engine fighter, capable of throwing a combined 400 rounds downrange every 60 seconds. At 250 yards, the exact convergence point where the streams of fire from both wings are harmonized to intersect, McKay squeezes the trigger on his control stick. The roar inside the cockpit is apocalyptic. The entire 7-ton aircraft shudders violently, visibly losing a few miles per hour of airspeed simply from the staggering recoil of the 8 heavy machine guns. Acrid, white cordite smoke instantly fills the cockpit, stinging McKay's eyes. Outside, a literal river of fire reaches across the sky. Tracers, armor-piercing slugs, and incendiary rounds, a lethal cocktail known as APIT, converge in a concentrated buzzsaw of destruction. The impact is devastating, unlike the light, explosive 20mm shells that had merely dented the P-47's armor. The concentrated mass of the American 50 calibers acts like a kinetic sledgehammer. The full of W-190 doesn't just take damage, it is systematically disassembled in mid-air. McKay watches the heavy slugs chew through the German's right wing root, snapping the main spar in a millisecond. Incendiary rounds pierce the fuselage fuel tank behind the cockpit. A blinding, brilliant ball of orange flame erupts from the Focke-Wulf. The right wing tears away completely, fluttering into the slipstream like a discarded autumn leaf. The rest of the shattered aircraft violently cartwheels out of the formation, trailing a thick, spiraling column of fire and black smoke toward the French countryside. Weber watches his wingman disintegrate into a cloud of glowing debris. A cold, creeping dread replaces the adrenaline in his veins. The laughter from earlier that morning feels like a distant, foolish memory. The Luftwaffe had mocked this massive, ugly machine. They had dismissed it as a flying target. But as Weber watches the P-47 roar effortlessly through the fireball of its kill, completely unscathed, the horrifying truth dawns on him. This isn't a lumbering bomber escort. It is an indestructible, heavily armored apex predator, and it refuses to fall from the sky. High above the clouds, Lieutenant Weber wrenches his Focke-Wulf away from the debris field, his morale completely shattered. He doesn't pursue. He simply watches as the massive American fighter, having violently dispatched his wingman, rolls inverted and plummets back toward the earth. McKay knows that lingering in the combat box without his own squadron is a death sentence. He needs to put distance between himself and the Abbeville boys, and the fastest way home is on the deck. At 400 miles per hour, the P-47 drops out of the overcast sky, leveling out a mere 200 feet above the sprawling, patchwork fields of northern France. The immense Pratt & Whitney engine howls, a deep, guttural thrum that vibrates through the soles of McKay's boots. Down here, the air is thick and turbulent. The heavy fighter bucks and heaves, but its sheer, unadulterated mass punches through the thermals like a runaway freight train. McKay adjusts his fuel mixture, his eyes scanning the horizon for the English Channel. But as he crests a low, wooded ridge near the Somme River, a target of opportunity materializes in the dusty haze below. Snaking along a dirt road is a German armored convoy. From the cockpit, McKay identifies the unmistakable, boxy silhouettes of Panzerkampfwagen 4s, accompanied by half-tracks and canvas-topped supply trucks. If you are a German panzer commander on the ground in 1943, you are taught to fear the high-altitude, heavy bombers or a coordinated artillery barrage. You are certainly not taught to fear a single lone fighter plane. Fighters carry light weapons meant for dogfights, not anti-tank operations. But the Thunderbolt is not a normal fighter. It is a flying armory. McKay doesn't hesitate. He banks the heavy ship hard to the left, lining up the nose of the P-47 with the rear of the armored column. He flips the gun, switches to fire. The 8 Browning machine guns are still hungry. He drops the nose, placing the glowing reticle over the rearmost tank, and squeezes the trigger. The beast erupts once more. The 8.50 caliber machine guns unleash a torrential downpour of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. At this shallow dive angle, the convergence of the guns acts like a concentrated industrial cutting torch. The stream of heavy, half-inch lead slugs strikes the thin top armor of the Panzer IV's engine deck. The kinetic energy is unimaginable. The rounds don't just ping off the steel, they shatter the engine louvers, penetrate the engine block, and instantly ignite the highly flammable aviation-grade fuel inside. The Panzer shudders to a violent halt, erupting in a geyser of oily black smoke and secondary explosions as the ammunition rack cooks off. Mackay holds the trigger down, ruddering slightly to walk the river of fire up the convoy. Soft-skinned Opel Blitz trucks are instantly vaporized, disintegrating into splinters and twisted axles. The sheer concussive force of 400 rounds a minute completely shatters the German column. Panic erupts on the ground as soldiers dive into the muddy ditches, covering their ears against the deafening roar of the radial engine and the terrifying crack of supersonic rounds snapping through the air. But the Germans are not defenseless. Positioned in the center of the column is a mounted flak-Vierling 38, a quad-barreled 20mm anti-aircraft gun. Its crew, recovering from the initial shock, traverses the turret and opens fire. A solid wall of green tracer fire reaches up into the sky, creating an inescapable web of lead. Flying at only 100 feet off the ground, Mackay has nowhere to maneuver. He flies straight into the teeth of the flak barrage. The noise inside the cockpit goes from a roar to a deafening clatter of horrific destruction. Bang, clang, thwack. Hundreds of 7.92mm machine gun rounds stitch a line across the Thunderbolt's broad left wing, tearing jagged, fist-sized holes through the aluminum skin. A 20mm explosive shell detonates against the right stabilizer, blowing a massive chunk of the elevator cleanly off the aircraft. Then comes the most terrifying sound a pilot can hear, a heavy, metallic crunch directly in front of the cockpit. A 20mm high-explosive flak round slams dead center into the Pratt & Whitney engine cowling. The explosion rips away a massive section of metal paneling and shears the top half of a massive steel cylinder entirely off the engine block. Black, viscous engine oil immediately splatters across Mackay's windshield, blinding him in a thick, hot slurry. In a British Spitfire or an American P-51 Mustang, a hit to the delicate liquid cooling system would mean instantaneous engine seizure. The pilot would have seconds to bail out before the engine melted itself into a block of slag. But the P-47's R2800 is an air-cooled radial engine. It has no liquid coolant to leak. It is a brute force marvel of heavy iron and steel. Mackay violently wipes a gloved hand across the interior of the Perspex canopy. Trying to see, the engine coughs violently, a horrific grinding noise echoing through the fuselage as metal grinds against metal. The airframe shakes so violently that Mackay's teeth rattle in his skull. The tachometer needle dances wildly. He braces for the engine to die, waiting for the inevitable silence and the sudden, terrifying drop to the earth. But the silence never comes. The damaged cylinder is dead, but the other 17 cylinders of the mighty Double Wasp simply roar louder, brutally forcing the engine to keep turning. It spits flame, it hemorrhages black oil, and it sounds like a dying metallic beast, but it does not stop pulling. Mackay hauls back on the stick, pulling the battered, smoking juggernaut out of the flak trap and rocketing back toward the safety of the English Channel. The German gunners lower their weapons, coughing in the dust, staring upward in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. They had pumped hundreds of rounds into the massive American aircraft. They had physically blown a piece of its engine away. And yet, the shattered machine was still flying. The English Channel is a notoriously unforgiving graveyard for aviators. If you are a fighter pilot nursing a crippled aircraft over these frigid, slate-grey waters, the math is brutally simple. You either make it to the white cliffs of Dover, or you freeze to death in a matter of minutes. Inside the shattered cockpit of his P-47, First Lieutenant Jack Mackay is living a mechanical nightmare. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, missing an entire cylinder head from the 20mm flak impact, is shaking the aircraft so violently that the needles on the instrument dials have vibrated entirely off their pins. The aerodynamic drag from the missing right elevator forces Mackay to hold the heavy control stick hard against his left thigh. A grueling test of physical endurance just to keep the wings level. Worse still, the ruptured engine block is hemorrhaging hot. Viscous black oil. It violently sprays back over the windshield, completely blinding him to see where he is going. Mackay is forced to crank back the razorback canopy and stick his head out into the slipstream. The 200 mile/hour sub-zero wind tears relentlessly at his leather helmet and goggles, freezing the sweat on his face and deafening him to anything but the howling rush of air and the horrific, grinding death rattle of the engine. Yet, despite the catastrophic structural damage, the missing flight controls, and the gaping holes punched through the fuselage, the 7-ton juggernaut simply refuses to die. The thick armor plate behind Mackay's seat had stopped 2 armor-piercing rounds from the Focke-Wulf earlier. The massive supercharger piping beneath him had absorbed flak shrapnel that would have severed the delicate coolant lines of a Mustang or a Spitfire. Through the oily haze and stinging wind, a faint, chalky line materializes on the horizon. The English coast. Mackay bleeds off his airspeed and begins a shallow, agonizing descent toward the United States Army Air Force's base at Halesworth, home of the 56th Fighter Group, but surviving the flight over the channel is only half the battle. Now, he has to land a 14,000-pound anvil without flaps, without a working airspeed indicator, and with a heavily damaged hydraulic system. As the manicured green fields of Suffolk rush up to meet him, Mackay reaches down and slams the landing gear lever into the downward position. Nothing happens. The hydraulic lines were shredded over France. Cursing through his oxygen mask, he grabs the emergency manual hydraulic pump next to the seat, with his left hand holding the stick in a literal death grip to prevent the plane from rolling over. He uses his right arm to violently pump the heavy metal handle. Up, down, up, down. His shoulder burns with lactic acid. Below the wings, the massive, wide-track landing gear slowly drops into the slipstream. Clunk, clunk. 2 green lights finally illuminate on the dash. The gear is locked. Mackay cuts the throttle. The engine, finally relieved of its agonizing duty, unleashes a deafening backfire and dies completely. The sudden silence in the cockpit is heavier than the noise. The Thunderbolt drops like a stone. At 130 miles per hour, the massive rubber tires smash into the steel matting of the runway. The impact is bone-jarring, because the left tire had been clipped by a German machine gun bullet. It instantly blows out upon touchdown. The P-47 violently slews to the left, metal wheel hubs screaming and sparking against the runway. Mackay stomps frantically on the right rudder pedal, fighting to keep the massive beast from flipping over into the grass. The aircraft skids for what feels like an eternity, tearing up chunks of earth and leaving a thick trail of black smoke, before finally grinding to a violent, shuddering halt near the edge of the perimeter track. For a long moment, the only sound is the ticking of the cooling metal and the hiss of evaporating oil. Mackay slumps back against the armor plating, his flight suit soaked in sweat and engine grease, his arms trembling uncontrollably. A jeep screams across the tarmac, followed by a frantic group of ground crewmen. Master Sergeant Miller, Mackay's veteran crew chief, leaps onto the wing before the crash trucks even arrive. He wrenches the canopy back fully and peers into the smoky cockpit. "You alive in there?" Lieutenant Miller shouts, his eyes wide. Mackay slowly unclips his oxygen mask, offering a weak, exhausted nod. "She's a little banged up, Sergeant." Miller helps pull the pilot onto the wing, and as McKay finally stands up, he gets his first look at the exterior of his aircraft. It is completely unrecognizable. The ground crews stand in stunned silence. They begin to count the holes. There are over 200 bullet impacts, riddling the wings and fuselage. The right horizontal stabilizer is simply gone, sheared off by explosive flak. The engine cowling is peeled back like a tin can, exposing the pulverized remains of a heavy steel cylinder, completely coated in baked oil. The fact that the engine had continued to turn for 200 miles is an engineering impossibility. Word quickly spreads through the 8th Air Force, and soon, reports echo across the entire European theater. The Luftwaffe pilots who had mocked the massive, ugly American fighter over the radio that morning would never laugh at it again. In the months that followed, the P-47 Thunderbolt would become the deadliest ground attack aircraft of the war, shattering Panzer divisions and annihilating German supply lines from Normandy to the Rhine. It was heavy, it was clunky, and it possessed none of the elegant grace of a Spitfire. But to the men who flew it, and to the terrified German troops who had to face it, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was something entirely different. It was an unkillable monster of American industry, and it brought its pilots home.